Haplogroup J equals Japheth, Part 4. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account, and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. The Uratrians in connection with the English, the Chechnyans, and the Armenians. So as mentioned before, Proto-Uratrians are believed to have been descendant and the language of the Kora-Araxes culture and people. The Uratrian languages are an extinct language family of the ancient Near East, comprising only two known languages, Horion and Uratrian. It is often assumed that the Uratrian languages, or a pre-split Proto-Uratrian language, were originally spoken in the Kora-Araxes culture, and the geographic distribution is in Armenia, Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Zagros Mountains, which is the typical area of the Kora-Araxes culture region. So this book details Uratrian in connection to the Kora-Araxes culture. It's called Uratrian from the lexico-statistical viewpoint. And it reads, the Uratrian linguistic family consists of two closely related languages, Hurian, with several dialects, and Uratrian. Despite the chronological distance between the attested Horion and Uratrian, it seems clear that the latter is not a direct descendant of the former, but the two languages represent two separate branches of a common proto-language, Proto-Uratrian. For the pre-literate period, it is natural to associate the Uratrian people with the Kora-Araxes early Trans-Caucasian archaeological culture. And this book, Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture, and it says, in the period immediately prior to the emergence of the Horians, the northern area of their distribution was occupied by the Kora-Araxes culture, circa 3400 through 2500 BC. The distribution of Kora-Araxes sites would encompass the territory of the Itu and Uratrians, as well as the northern part of the Horians. It is often assumed that the Kora-Araxes culture is an archaeological reflection of the Horians. So since the Kora-Araxes culture is connected to Uratrians, what modern population are connected to the Uratrians? So there are various interpretations on the relationship with Uratu and Uratrians and Hurians. Iger Denkov, Fritz Hommel, and others have suggested ties between the Proto-Uratrian language and the Proto-Northeastern Caucasian languages, leading to the proposal of the Alduin language family. Amejed Jonica notes in his book, The Chechnyans, some authorities believe that the Nak nation was an offspring of the Horians and Uratrians, builders of the magnificent civilizations of the Near East that had a profound influence upon other cultures in the region. According to some modern data, Chechnyans are genetically, linguistically, and anthropologically considered the descendants of the Horians and Uratrians. According to the opinion of Caucasus folklorist Amjad Jonica, it is certain that the Nak constituted an important component of the Hurrian Uratrian tribes in the Transcaucasus and played a role in the development of their influential cultures. And this is a translation of a book dealing with the Chechnyan Nation in connection to the Horians. This was translated from Russian to English. So the English translation reads, "This sounds extremely unexpected, but it is. The Chechnyan Nation is the ethnic root part of the Caucasian race, one of the oldest sources of human civilization. The fundamental principle of spirituality passed through the Horian, Matani, and Uratrian cultures." And this is from the ATLAS Monthly Geography and Exploration magazine, March 2003. And the English translation reads, "Today, Uratrians do not deny the kinship of the Chechnyans with the Uratrians. The kinship of the Horians, Uratrians, Chechnyans is confirmed by those who studied it. Hence, the following conclusion follows. Chechnyans are Uratrians. Uratrians is the remaining branch of the Chechnyans in Asia Minor. Actually, its structure, grammatical features, completeness, and grammar of classes, etc. Uratrian and Chechnyan are similar to each other." And here is another translation. I believe it was either originally in Russian or perhaps German, but I think that's Russian. But the English translation reads, "The Uratrians themselves are Aldoians, called their country and state Belesli, from which comes the modern name of Lake Van, in the basin of which the center of this state was located since ancient times. Uratrian or Aldoian tribes akin to the Horian population of the countries to the southwest of Lake Van lived around Lake Van and in adjacent areas. The Uratrian, as well as the Horian language, belong to a special linguistic family. Among the modern languages and closest to them are some languages of the North Caucasus, Chechnyan, and English." And here is another Russian translation dealing with the Chechnyans, the English, and the Horians. And it reads, "Of the peoples existing in our own time, the Chechnyans and English are the closest to the Hurrian Uratrian in terms of language." And here is a German translation dealing with the Hurians and the Vanik peoples. "The long-standing assumptions about the connections of the Hurrian and Uratrian with the Caucasian languages have received serious confirmation thanks to the collected correspondences identified in the Northeast Caucasian languages, and especially in Vanik." And we know that the Vanik are basically the Chechnyan and English and other related Northeast Caucasian tribes. So here's a map displaying the region of the Uratrian, and it's basically south of the Caucasus and the northern part of the Near East. That's it in brown. So this is the book, The Chechnyans, that details specifically the history of Chechnyans and the English and the Venek peoples. And it reads, on the other hand, the North Caucasian perspective goes back to the most ancient of Caucasian cultures, dating back to more than 5 millennia ago. For thousands of years, the Venek lived in their North Caucasian domicile, which waxed and waned as invaders came and went, but was perceived more or less intact due to the nation's remarkable tendency. Linguistic evidence ties Venek culture to the ancient Hurian and Uratrian civilizations that flourished in the Near East a few millennia ago. The Venek also constituted an important element in the Neolithic Kora-Araxes culture in the Trans-Caucasus. And this is the book, The Veneks, the Chechnyan and the English, and it reads, when discussing the matter of the origin of the Veneks, it is also very important, to take into consideration their genetic affiliation to the eastern branch of the Caucasian ethno-linguistic family. According to some scientists, the tribe speaking the Eastern Caucasian Venek Dagestani and the languages cognate to them inhabited not only the eastern part of the northern Caucasus and Transcaucasia, but also the territory of Front Asia right up to the Zagros, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Asia Minor, quite possibly penetrating into certain islands of the Mediterranean. In particular, the thesis of kinship of ancestors of the Venek Dagestani peoples with the Horians and Uratrians, the cultural nations of ancient times, who formed the powerful states of the ancient East in the 2nd through 1st millennia BC, carries more conviction. As it is supposed, the Proto-Hurrian, Uratrian, and other Eastern Caucasian languages are related to each other nearly the same way as the ancient written languages of the Indo-European family. In this book, this is from the Oxford Handbook of Ancient Anatolia, and it reads that Uratrian as a whole shared a yet earlier common ancestor with some of the numerous and comparatively obscure languages of the Caucasus is not improbable. Modern Caucasian languages are conventionally divided into southern, northwestern, and northeastern families. Georgian, for example, belongs to the southern family. Vankov and Starström, in the most thorough attempt at finding a linkage yet published, have argued that Uratrian is a branch of the Eastern Caucasian family. This would make it a distinct relative of such modern languages as Chechnyan, Avar, Lak, and Uid. So here is a map detailing the Uratrian Zone, and as you can see, it is in the northern part of the Near East, south of the Caucasus. And it's this giant blue right here. So modern populations that are considered to be the descendants of Uratrians would basically be the northeastern Caucasians, such as Chechnyans and English and other related groups. Another population that is believed to descend from the Uratrians are the Armenians. even though they are an Indo-European people, basically there's an ancient connection between ancient Indo-Europeans and Proto-Caucasians. The Horians were a people of the Bronze Age Near East. They spoke a Uratrian language called Hurian and lived in Anatolia, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. The largest and most influential Horian nation was the Kingdom of Matani, its ruling class perhaps being Indo-Iranian speakers. The population of the Indo-European speaking Hittite Empire in Anatolia included a large population of Hurians, and there is significant Hurrian influence in Hittite mythology. By the early Iron Age, the Horians had been assimilated by other peoples. Their remnants were subdued by a related people that formed the state of Uratu. Here's the key thing to keep in mind, detailing the Armenians. The present-day Armenians are an amalgam of the Indo-European groups with the Horians and Uratrians. So basically, it is believed that the Armenians are a mixture of Indo-Europeans and Horians as well as Uratrians. So this book details that very thing. This book is called About the Vocalic System of Armenian Words of Substrict Origin. And it reads, Levon Mesretiz was the first to propose that some Armenian words were of Uratrian origin. Following improvements in the understanding of Uratrian inscriptions, steadily progress has been ongoing in this chapter of Armenian lexicography. Apart from providing a critical compilation of potential substrict lexicons, the present paper focuses on the vocalic system embedded in these words, for which a Uratrian origin seems quite certain. So here's another book dealing with Armenians and Uratrians, and it's called The Indo-European Elements in Horion, and it says, Horion is closely related to the Uratrian language, which was spoken in eastern Anatolia, a little to the north and east of Horion, between about 850 and 600 BCE. Uratrian is not a descendant of Horion, rather they are sister languages, both going back to a common Uratrian parent language, possibly located in the northeast of Mesopotamia, in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, and date to before the 3rd millennia BC. Dinkoff concludes that Uratrian is not a late dialect of Horian, but a separate language derived from one parent, with the latter, and in some respects, receiving more archaic features than the Horian language. Uratrian remained spoken long enough for Armenian to borrow a few words with fairly clear Uratrian origin. And here is yet another book detailing the connection with Horians and Armenians. The book is called A Grammatical Sketch of Classical Armenian, and it reads, The area where Armenians settled had been previously inhabited by speakers of Uratrian, a non-Indo-European language whose only relative is Horian, spoken in northern Iraq from circa 2200 until circa 1200 BC. While Uratrian is mostly known from short monumental public inscriptions, Horian is by far better attested because of the large number of cuneiform inscriptions found in Mari, Bajahazko, and etc. There are certainly some loanwords of Uratrian origin in Armenian, and it has been argued that a Huru-Uratrian substring influenced the structure of Armenian to a large extent. For example, Horion and Uratrian both had a rather complex system of consonants and consonant clusters, a clearly agglutinative structure or agglutive structure, a rich case system, and the lack of grammatical gender. The influence of the substratum on Armenian is undeniable, as a large portion of Armenian vocabulary is of unknown origin. And so this book, Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture, also details the connection between Armenian and Hurrian, and it reads, "It has been calculated that no more than 450, certainly no more than 500 Armenian words are directly inherited from Proto-Indo-European. The early non-Iranian words, though much smaller in number, are not without their interest as well. The language that preceded Armenian in northeastern Asia Minor was Uratrian, itself a close relative of the better-known Horion. The close agreement in shape of these classical Armenian words and their presumed sources is remarkable, especially as the actual borrowing is likely to have taken place a millennia or millennia and a half before Armenian is first attested. Armenian, the territory of the Armenian language, appears to have been roughly coincidental with that of the earlier non-Indo-European Horian and closely related Uratrian with dark shading. And by dark shading, this is what they mean. The dark shading is where Horian and Uratrian typically would have been. Many of these languages occurred partly or wholly the earlier territory of the Core Araxes culture, light shading. And the lighter shade is, the Core Araxes culture, and there's a bit of overlap. So the nearest Indo-European neighbors of the Armenians were the Hittites and related Luvians and the Paralic-speaking populations, who were not closely related to Armenian. The starting points for any discussion of the Armenian origins must emphasize that the territory in which the Armenian language has been historically attested, the contemporary Republic of Armenia and Eastern Turkey, was occupied during the Bronze Age by speakers of Horian and the closely related Uratrian. The earliest Horian inscriptions are dated to the mid-3rd millennium BC, and these run into the 2nd millennia BC. The southern border of the Horians extended to Syria and southeast into the area inhabited in modern times by Kurds along the Iran/Iraq frontier. To the south of the Horians, even overlapping with them, were the lands of the Semitic-speaking peoples. It has been suggested that the Horian language is related to the modern northeastern Caucasian language group, Nak-Dangestani. By the 1st millennium BC, the Horians had disappeared. They were replaced by the southeastern portion of their former territory by the Uratrians, who spoke a language closely related to Horian. North of the Uratrians in the northern part of the formerly Horian area. To the east of the Horian-Uratrian Elitko complex were the Gutians, or Kutians, known only from personal and place names that suggest a different and unrelated language grouping, who occupied the territory south of Lake Umra in what is now Iran. To the west of the Horian-Uratrian complex were various members of the Indo-European Anatolian group, Luvians in the south, in the southern Anatolian, and Hittites, who had replaced the non-Indo-European Hatti and taken their name, and Pelic speakers in central Anatolia. The Armenians, according to Vankov, are then an amalgam of the Horians and Uratrians, Luvians, and the Proto-Armenian Mushki, who carried their Indo-European language eastwards across Anatolia. So basically, Armenians are a mixture of Horians and Indo-Europeans, basically. So modern populations that would descend from Uratrians would basically be Caucasian populations such as Chechnyans, English, Armenians, Nak-Dagestani peoples, etc., and other related groups of the Caucasus. And genetically speaking, Uratrians likely would have carried haplogroup J, considering that its descendants, the Chechnyans and the English, still carry it at high percentages. This is from How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads, the Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands in present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the Khurax's culture. Three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS2872, and J1-Z5353, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggest Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the Khurax's culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family linking to the Northeast Caucasian. And that fits along with everything that we've just covered. And continuing, it says, regarding the Northwest Caucasian language family, broader analysis of other genetic components by Yunbeskvi confirmed that Northwest Caucasian populations also originated from south of the Caucasus, thus from within the cradle of the Neolithic Middle East. This also supports their supposed relations to the Indo-European family. And we talked about how Armenians are sort of a mixture of Caucasian and Indo-European. But continuing, it says, and suggests that the homeland must have been in close proximity with that of the Indo-European homeland in eastern Anatolia. On the other hand, it must have been west of the Northeast Caucasian homeland, as the latter seem to have covered the entire Khurax's area. The presence of J2-M67 in the Northwest Caucasian populations also points to the origins south of the Caucasus, although as J2-M67 is present in human populations belonging to both Northwest Caucasian and Northeast Caucasian language groups, it is somewhat ambiguous to which language family did the population that introduced it in the region belong to. This is from Parallel Evolution of Genes and Languages in the Caucasus region, and it reads, again, haplogroup J2A4B*-M67 comprise 51 through 79% of the Y chromosomes in the English and 3 Chechnyan populations, Northeast Caucasus Nak linguistic group. Finally, haplogroup J1*-M267 comprise 44 through 99% of the Southeast Caucasus Dagestan linguistic group, basically Nak-Dagestani groups. So the genetic connection is also very interesting, but we should, expect this. With that being said, perhaps the most interesting thing about all of this is the cultural aspects between Chechnyans, English, and Armenians, and all these Caucasian populations. Because remember, they all have a tradition of descending from Togarma. Another, Togarma, this one being the son of Tyrus and Gomer, is mentioned by Armenian Moses of Caron and Georgian Litoni Mevaloni, who regarded Togarma as the founder of their nations along with other Caucasian groups or peoples. According to Moses of Caron's History of Armenia and to Litoni Mevaloni's medieval Georgian chronicles, Torgomos was thought to have lived in Babylon before he received the land between two seas and two mountains, i.e., the Caucasus, in his possession. He then settled near Mount Ararat and divided his land among his sons. Hayek, first son of Torgomos, inherited Mount Ararat and founded the Armenian nation. Cartelos settled in northeast from Ararat, founder of Karliti, who united other brothers and founded the Georgian nation. Herlos settled in the eastern part of Ararat, and Caucasus or Kavoskas settled beyond the Caucasus range. So Caucasus or Kavoskas was the supposed ancestor of Chechnyans and English, according to the Georgian chronicles. And as you can see, it would go from Noah to Japheth to Gomer to Gorma and then to Caucasus. And then dealing with the Armenians, this is from Insight on the Scripture, Volume 2. Togarma, many commentators connect Togarma with the Armenians. The Armenians themselves traditionally claim to be descendant from Hayek, son of Torgom. Ancient Greek writers speak of the Armenians as famed for their horses and mules. So it's highly likely that these early Uratrians are the descendants of Togarma, and that populations like Chechnyans, English, and Armenians are the modern-day descendants of Togarma. Furthermore, Haplogroup J would also likely be the paternal lineage of Togarma as well. This is just something to think about. But this is where we end the Uratrian, the English, the Chechnyans, and the Armenians. The history of the Horians. So in the past, we talked a lot about the Horians, but let's actually learn about them. So, who are the Horians? The Horians were a people of the Bronze Age Near East. They spoke a Uratrian language called Horion and lived in Anatolia, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. The Horians descended from the mountains south of the Caspian Sea, occupied the land between the Hittites and Assyria, east of the Tigris River, and in the Zagros mountain range. From there, they spread into the areas of northern Mesopotamia and Syria as well, even to the Mediterranean coast. So here's just a map of the Horians. It is in yellow, their concentration. So this is from BibleGateway.com, and it reads, Origin and geographic distribution. Groups either designating themselves as Horians, cuneiform Huri, or writing a language identified elsewhere with the Huri, have been identified all over the ancient Near East, from ancient Nuzi, east of the Tigris River, to Hutasa or Hatasa in Central Asia Minor, to Palestine, and even lower, i.e. northern Egypt. In Akkadian sources, whether from Nuzi, Mari, Hutasa, Alahane, Ugaritic, or Egypt, Al-Armana, the people and their language were termed Huri. The Egyptians called the land of Palestine Huri, but spelled it in cognates Hor. In the Matani letter found at Almarna, the native Horian term was Hurau or Hurao. In the Old Testament, the corresponding term is, which is in Hebrew, from earlier Huri. The language of the Horians, which is still only partially understood, seems related to only one other known language, Uratrian. In which the kings of Uratu around Lake Van composed inscriptions during the first half of the first millennium BC, circa 900 through 600 BC. It is believed by some that both Horian and Uratrian belong to languages of the Caucasus, ancient Armenia. History. Horians appeared in the Near East as early as the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, which was 2300. Horians occupied the great half-circle of the Tartarus Mountains from Ukarish, north of Karkash, to the country of Namur, around Lake Van, and perhaps as far south as the upper Zeb River. It is from circa 1400 BC that the great influx of Horian deities and Horian mythology in the Hittite corpus is dated. The greatest political achievement of the Horians was the Kingdom of Matani, whose capital was Washhuana in the middle Euphrates Valley. At its height, circa 1400 BC, Matani dominated Kezuwata and North Syria, on the west Assyria in the central region, and Nuzi in the east. During this period, from 15 through 1400 BC, Matani was ruled by kings who bore Indo-Aryan, i.e. non-Hurrian names, such as Shutarna, Harshatarna, Shushkarshnatar, and Artama, and Tush-Arata. They carried on royal correspondence and international trade with the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty of Egypt as equals. So here is a map of the general area where the Horians would have been. And then, of course, you have surrounding peoples like the Hittites and Luvians and the Armenians, who are kind of connected with Horians. And you have the Semites more towards the south, northwest Semites over here, and the Akkadians and Arabians. So this is where the Horians would have been, basically in the very center of the general Middle East, but to the north of Mesopotamia. So this is from Britannia, and it says, the Horians entered the orbit of ancient Middle Eastern civilization toward the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. According to the Soviet scholars Igor M. Dengov and Sergei A. Starshin, the Eastern Caucasian languages are an offshoot of the Horian Uratrian group. Horian, one of a people important in the history and culture of the Middle East during the 2nd millennium BC, the earliest recorded presence of Horian personal and place names is in Mesopotamian records of the late 3rd millennium. This point to the area east of the Tigris River and the mountain range of Zagros as the Horian habitat. From then on, and especially during the early 2nd millennium, there is scattered evidence of a westward spread of Horians, and even greater westward migration probably set in motion by the intrusion of Indo-Iranians from the north seems to have taken place after 1700 BC, apparently issuing from the area between Lake Van and the Zagros. Evidence indicates that the Horians overthrew the Assyrian rulers and subsequently dominated the area. Horians likewise occupied large sections of eastern Anatolia, thereby becoming eastern neighbors and later partial dependents of the Hittites. And one of the most interesting sections from that part was the fact that the Horians overthrew the Assyrian rulers, which, of course, Assyrians being Semitic, so that's very, very interesting. These non-Semitic people overthrowing a Semitic dynasty. It's very interesting. Now it says, yet the Horian heartland during this period was northern Mesopotamia, and the country then known as Huri, where the political units were dominated by dynasties of Indo-Iranian origin. In the 15th century BC, the Horian area, ranging from the Iranian mountains to Syria, was united into a state called Matani. Despite political subjugation, the continued Horian ethnic and cultural presence in Syria and the Sicilian region, which was called Kiswadina, strongly influenced the Hittites. The carvings at Yez Ali Kaya, for instance, suggest that the official pantheon of the Hittite Empire was thoroughly Hurionized. Hittite queens had Horian names, and Horian mythology appeared in Hittite epic poems. So the Hittites were greatly influenced by the Horians, and the Horians seem to have put their fingers into a lot of ancient Near Eastern civilizations. It's very interesting to see that they had such influence on these people groups. So continuing, it reads, it is not known whether the migrations of the Horians ever took the form of aggressive invasion. 18th century BC text from Mari speaks of battles with the Horian tribes of Tertuku, south of Lake Aruma, some 150 miles from the Caspian Sea's southwest corner. But these were mountain campaigns, not the warding off of an offensive. In the 15th century, Al-Laqi was heavily Hurionized, and in the Empire of Matani, the Horians represented the leading and perhaps the most numerous population group. And excuse me for any mispronunciations of some of these words. But it's very interesting how the Horians began to become quite numerous in these areas of the ancient Near East, becoming large in number. So the Horian and Matani kingdoms. The weakening of the Semitic states in Mesopotamia after 1550 BC enabled the Horians to penetrate deeper into this region, where they founded numerous small states in the eastern part of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. After 1500 BC, isolated dynasties appeared with Indo-Aryan names, but the significance of this is disputed. So it's very interesting how many of these Semitic states began to weaken, which gave rise to the Horians that began to make small city-states. I think this is very important for us to understand when it comes to the ancient Near East, and with us knowing that the Horians are a non-Semitic people, and that they are beginning to really set up shop within the ancient land of the Middle East. This is very important to know when studying these ancient populations and peoples and civilizations. So here is where the Hurians would have been. Again, a people of the northeastern Caucasian stock, and they were set up pretty much in northern Mesopotamia and in parts of Syria and Anatolia and Iran. And as you can see right here, this is the Matani Empire that I was talking about. And here are the Horians, and here's Uratu. So this is just one map showing the typical area where these non-Semitic people and civilizations were. So this is from World History Encyclopedia, and it reads, detailing the Horians. The Horians, aka Huri or Khuri, were a Bronze Age people who flourished across the Near East from the 4th millennium BCE to the 1st millennium BCE. Horians formed the principal cultural elements of the Bronze Age Matani Kingdom and blended with the culture of the neighboring and then conquering Hittites. By the late Bronze Age, the Horians had been assimilated into surrounding cultures in the Near East, but many of their gods and mythologies will live on in later cultures, notably the Uratu civilization, and even inspired elements of mythology found in archaic Greece. That part's fairly interesting, especially if the Horians carried haplogroup J, and we know that J markers came into ancient Greece, so that part is fairly interesting. Continuing, it says, probably Huri was originally the designation bore by the population group, which was then applied to the land they inhabited and the language they spoke. Horian has only one other related ancient language, Uratrian, and their connection to any living languages is uncertain. Typologically, Horian is an agglutinating language with ergative grammar, unlike Indo-European and Semitic, but like the Sumerian language. So basically, the structure of Horian is it's not Indo-European and it's not Semitic, basically, but it's similar to Sumerian, which we covered in the past. Horian speakers inhabited a core area that is the upper Habur and Tigris rivers up to the Tartarus and Zagros mountains, especially around Lake Van. Textual evidence of the Horians dates to the mid-3rd millennium BCE, but based on archaeological evidence, it is likely the culture at least stretched back to the mid-4th millennium BCE, generally known in ancient sources as the Hori. The culture and language may also be referred to as a substratu or substratians. While in biblical text, they are the Horites, strictly speaking, the descendants of the Horians and Canaan. Very interesting. We'll touch more on that later. One of the earliest and most important Horian sites was Ugarish, and it is from here that the earliest known inscriptions of the language were discovered. Other Mesopotamian city-states with evidence of the worship of Horian gods and personal names include Karib and Nagar, starting from the 4th millennium BCE. Then the Horians thrived and expanded across Upper Mesopotamia. It is likely that the Horian conquest of the region was a complex phenomenon, including peaceful migration, infiltration by mercenary bands and the pay of local city-states, followed by the rise of a power of mercenary warlords, culminating in the eventual full-scale migration of Horian herding tribes out of the mountains into the more fertile river valleys. Further, the Horians often seem to have adopted the culture of the city-states they conquered, making them less visible than ever in recorded history. For example, we have no evidence of a distinctive Horian military system. It seems that if ever there were a people who were both everywhere and nowhere, it was the Horians. And that's very interesting. This does seem to be the traits of the Horians and other Horian-related tribes and people, that there was a lot of them, and they came into the Middle East through various different ways, like warfare or peaceful, but they typically adopted and assimilated into the cultures, and typically that would be Semitic or Indo-European cultures of the Near East. So that's very interesting and something to keep in mind about these ancient people. So continuing, it says, when the kingdom of Akkad fell in 2190 BCE, the Horians and others exploited the constant power vacuum in Mesopotamia. There was no Hurrian Empire as such, but some of the independent city-states ruled by Hurrian kings may well have formed together in a loose confederation. Still, others were in conflict with each other. By the second quarter of the second millennium BCE, the Horians were migrating into northern Syria and eastern Anatolia as they moved westward and southward. Once again, military conquest was mixed with the peaceful migration of Horian merchants, farmers, artisans, and nomads. The Matani Kingdom, 1500 through 1240 BCE, which was predominantly Horian in culture. And so that's, again, it's interesting how it's emphasized that after Akkad, which was a Semitic Mesopotamian civilization, fell, this is when these Horians began to come into Mesopotamia and basically sweep through the land. It seems to be that most of the time when the Semitic empires fell, that's when the Horians came in. And again, it's either through military or it's through peaceful migration that these Horians typically migrated. So it's very important to keep in mind. So here is a map of the Matani that I mentioned quite often. And the Matani was, as they said, heavily populated by Horian peoples. And the Matani Empire was quite large. It took most of northern Mesopotamia and even parts of more central Mesopotamia. And this would have been where a lot of Horians were concentrated. So this is from Archaeology Archive, and the title is "Who Were the Hurians?" and a publication of the Archaeological Institute of America. So it reads, but Iper Michael Oski, an Assyrianologist at the University of Michigan, notes that Horian, like Sumerian, is a language unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European tongues that dominated the region during and after the 3rd millennium BC. Perhaps, he suggests, the Horians were either inhabitants of the region who, like the Sumerians, had to make room for the Semitic-speaking peoples who created the world's first empire based at Akkad in central Mesopotamia around 2350 BC. Far from being yet another rough nomadic tribe, such as the Amorites or Kassites, who were latecomers to the Mesopotamian party. The Horians and their unique language, music, deities, and rituals may have played a key role in shaping the first cities, empires, and states. Now that's very powerful. The language has died. The music faded, and the rituals are forgotten. But thanks to the sculptors, stonemasons, and seal carvers at Ugrish, Horian creativity can shine once again. And so that's one thing you're going to hear a lot about the Hurians when these archaeologists talk about them, that they were a great influence in the ancient Near East. And that makes sense because these people are so heavily populated in that time. They were numerous, as most of these archaeologists say and historians say. So it makes sense that they will be a great influence on the ancient Near East. This is again why the Hurians are very important people to study if you want to know about the ancient Near East. So here is the Matani Empire again, just showing you visually where the Hurians would have been concentrated, because remember, the Hurians were one of the most numerous people in Matani. They basically created Matani, even though it was ruled by Iranian peoples. But this is a wide range, and it's very interesting how they managed to do this. It was after the fall of Akkad, after the fall of Semitic dynasties. So this is the narrative literature of Horian origin, moving treasures from the ancient Near East, and it reads, the Horians were one of the most important civilizations of the ancient Near East, but we have far less linguistic, historical, and archaeological information about them than the Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, or Hittites. The Horian epic poems are also a fascinating but lesser known aspect of ancient Near Eastern literary traditions, but the Horians played another critical role creating and transmitting Mesopotamian traditions across the ancient world, even as far as Greece, which we read about earlier. Over 1,000 years of history, circa 2500 through 1300 BCE, Horian civilization occupied a vast area from the lower Zeb east of the Tigris to southeast Anatolia, embracing all of northern Mesopotamia and Syria. This helps us to understand how Horian culture embodied the convergence of different cultural traditions. The modern name of the people, Horians, and their language is based on the ancient geographical term Huri, attested in cuneiform sources of the 2nd millennium BCE, and presumably denoted most of Upper Mesopotamia. The Horian language was neither Semitic nor Indo-European, and had only one relative, Uratrian, attested in the 1st millennium BCE. The oldest historical and archaeological evidence for Horian civilization dates to the latter 3rd millennium BCE, and small kingdoms across northern Mesopotamia were governed by rulers with Horian names. One of these, the ancient city of Ugrish, was recently excavated at Mozan in the Kehreb Valley of northeast Syria. A foundation inscription of Tish Atal, a ruler of Ugrish, who bore the Horian regal title Indin, is the oldest document of the Horian language. A distinctive feature of the Horian culture and civilization is the coexistence of Sumero-Akkadian influences and original Horian elements. In effect, Horians were intermediaries passing Mesopotamian traditions to the western areas of the ancient Near East. During the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE, solid Hurrian element in the population of Syria between the Mediterranean and the Euphrates is attested by the many Hurrian personal names in texts, and is likely a result of movements at the end of the previous millennium. During their movements towards more western regions of Syria and southeast Anatolia, Horians encountered Northwest Semitic cultural and religious traditions, which henceforth played a fundamental role in Horian culture. So that's interesting. A lot of Horians began to move into Syria, a region that we typically associate with Semites, but these non-Semitic populations came in, and it was heavily Semitic, but you begin to see sort of like a fusion, which is interesting. The largest and most important Horian state, the Matani Kingdom, flourished during the second half of the 2nd millennium BCE, and occupied a wide area between Nuzi in eastern Iraq and Kizuwata in southeastern Anatolia. Mitanni was one of the great kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age, and for a century fought with Egypt for supremacy over Syria. In the first half of the 14th century, stability was reached between the great kings of Mitanni and the Egyptian pharaohs. Dynastic marriages between princesses of Mitanni and Egyptian pharaohs resulted, attested in the corpus diplomatic correspondence between the two courts discovered in the Egyptian archives at the capital of El Ormana. And that's very interesting. We see mixing with the royal dynasties of Egypt with these Matani people. And of course, we know, as we've read, the Matani, their population was Horion, a northeast Caucasian people, but their ruling class was Indo-Aryan or Indo-Iranian people. So perhaps this could be a way or explain some of the more European genetic components into Egypt, the more Iranian type of components into Egypt, as well as the Caucasian. It's very interesting. But Matani state could not resist the military expansions of the Hittite Empire under King Sebu Ulamina I, who conquered most of Matani's Syrian territory and decreed the end of this great kingdom in 1340 BCE. So here's just a map detailing the Horians and related Horian peoples. So you got the Matani Empire right here, and the Horians and the Uratu, and this sort of what we're dealing with. Here's another map detailing it, the Matani and the Hurians right here, and the Uratu. So this kind of gives you a visualization of everything that's going on. So this is a book also explaining the Horians. It's called The Indo-European Elements in Horian, and it says, the Horian language is attested from the last centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE until around the middle of the 13th century BCE. Horian was the language of the once powerful Matani Kingdom. And here's a map just showing it. After the Assyrian conquest of the areas peopled by Hurians in northern Mesopotamia, many of them seem to have been deported by Tukulti Nimruta I, which was around 1244 through 1208 BCE, who named manpower to build his new capital, who needed manpower to build his new capital. And that's very interesting. That seems to be something Assyrians did quite often. They would remove people from their homelands and then bring them to their land to do work, and sometimes even import new people into the land. That's actually what happened with the Israelites as well. They were taken out and other people were placed in, and this happened with the Horians. But anyways, it reads, these events probably caused major disruption in the survival of the Horian language. According to McQueen and Gregg, Horian became extinct not long after the fall of that kingdom in the 13th century BCE, probably around 1000 BCE. And that's fairly interesting because obviously there are such a numerous people, but their language became extinct. But although the language is gone, keep in mind that doesn't mean the people is gone. And as we read earlier about the Hurians, they often adopted and assimilated into people, so they could have assimilated into these surrounding peoples, like all the Semitic nations that they were around. So keep in mind, although the language might be gone, the people doesn't have to be gone. So something to remember. So this book also details the Horians, and it's called Facts, Fiction, and the Bible. The truth behind the stories in the Old Testament. And it reads, the Horians came from Armenia, but their ruling class were Aryans, who originated from central Russia, from the region east and north of the Caspian and Aral Seas. They founded the Hurrian Empire, also known as the Kingdom of Matani, named after an Aryan clan. They introduced the composite bow, which was a formidable long-range weapon, infantry weapon, and they had developed a lightweight spoked two-wheeled version of the chariot. Because of their military superiority, they were able to extend their influence throughout Syria and Palestine, preferring to live in the cities where they became the local ruling class. Interesting. So here are the Hurians, by the way, just another map so I can really like drill in to y'all the location of the Horians. I think that's very important to know where they were, and to just show that that the Middle East had a lot of different peoples there in the ancient times, not just all Semites. So here is another good book dealing with the Hurians. This is the Armenian Journal of Near Eastern Societies, and it reads, "The Horian language is one of the extinct languages which were once spoken in the area around Mesopotamia and the Caucasus in the last 4th millenniums BCE. Its first attestations date back to the last centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE, circa 2300. At the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, Horian is attested in southeastern Anatolia and in the Zagros-Tartarus range of northern Mesopotamia. In the middle of the 2nd millennium, Horian influence is also attested in Syria and in Sicilia or Kizawada region. Horian was the main language of the Matani Kingdom, as it attested by the so-called Matani letter, written by Tarushnat, king of Matani, to Menotep III. The proto-history of the Horian language and people is shrouded with some uncertainty, but there are good indications that the presence of Horian people in Upper Mesopotamia is fairly ancient. To start with, Horian is closely related to the Uratrian language, which was spoken in eastern Anatolia, a little to the north and east of Horian between about 850 and 600 BCE. Uratrian is not a descendant of Horian, rather they are sister languages, both going back to a common Hurro-Uratrian parent language, probably located to the northeast of Mesopotamia in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, and dated to before the 3rd millennium BCE. Dankoff, who can be credited for establishing the relationship between the two languages, concludes that Uratrian is not a late dialect of Horian, but a separate language derived from one. So here is the kingdom of the Horians, or the Horian kingdom. Here's Ukarish, Horians. So this is just another map, just detailing where they're at. Have your Semites to the south. They are distinguished because there's Semite nomads and Akkad, Semite nomads and Bedouins. And then you got the Horians up here. So here is a book also talking about the Horians, The History of Ancient Palestine. And it reads, among the invaders of Syria during the 2nd millennium BCE were the Horians, a non-Semitic people which, as time went by, created one of the most powerful states in the Near East, namely the Matani Kingdom. The spread of the Horian, I just want to detail that right there. These Horians, a non-Semitic people, they had a powerful empire in Syria in the ancient Near East. And I think that is just extremely fascinating. And that's something that I have not known about the ancient Near East in the past. But now that I'm getting more of this understanding of the ancient Near East, it's interesting to see that there was just various different peoples living there. Not everybody was Semitic. You had non-Semitic people in places that today have a lot of Semitic speakers. So it's interesting to see that. So continuing, it reads, the spread of the Horians as well as their influence is witnessed by texts from Nuzi, Baghazako, Alaki, Mari, Rash Shrama, Tel Armarna, and the Ta'ak in Palestine, among other places. And forgive me for my mispronunciations. They are known from Anatolia from circa 2400 BCE and from about 2300 BCE. They were settled in the hill regions of Upper Mesopotamia where they established a kingdom, Ugrish. The text from Alak at level 7 show that around 1700 BC, a third of the population of that city was Horion, and circa 100 years later, the Horians were the majority. Now that's fairly interesting. And by the way, that's a area in Syria that they're referring to, a city in Syria. The same is true for Ugrit in the 15th century. It was only when Ugrit was freed from Horian political dominance in the 14th century BCE that its literary golden age came about. I. M. Denkov thinks that the original home of the Horians could have been in Transcaucasia. From a cultural point of view, the Horians can be considered as one of the most important peoples of the Near East. Like I said, most people are going to say this when it comes to the Horians, most scholars. That's why you have to know about these people. Anyways, already in the Akkad period, which was around 2300 BCE, they had acquired the art of writing using the cuneiform for their own language. Horian is an agglutinative language related to Uratrian and North Caucasian. So again, just detailing again where these Horians are. Here you see in italics the Horians in south of the Caucasus, north of Mesopotamia and Iran. And you have other non-Semitic speakers like the Hattians and Anatolia, Hurians and Hattians and such. And these peoples will eventually come into Semitic lands. I have Kassites right here and Gutians right there. So here is the book, The Chechnyans, that does a really good breakdown of the Horians as well as their descendants today and the language they spoke. And it reads, on the other hand, the North Caucasian perspective goes back to the most ancient of Caucasian cultures, dating back to more than the 5th millennium ago. For thousands of years, the Vanak lived in their North Caucasian domicile, which waxed and waned as invaders came and went, but was preserved more or less intact due to the nation's remarkable tendency. Linguistic evidence ties Vanak culture to the ancient Hurrian and Uratrian civilizations that flourished in the Near East a few millennia ago. The Vanak also constituted an important element in the Neolithic Core-Araxes culture in the Transcaucasus. Some authors believe that the Nak nation was an offspring of the Hurians and Uratrians, builders of magnificent civilizations in the ancient Near East that had profound influences upon other cultures of the region. It is certain that the Nak constituted an important component of the Hurian Uratrian tribes in the Transcaucasus and played a role in the development of their influential cultures. E. A. Spencer suggested that the Transcaucasus was the original Hurrian homeland. Some scholars also propose the existence of a linguistic and cultural Northeast Caucasian and Hurrian, later Uratrian, spinal continuum. The most probable theory of Nak ancestry is that it was a reunion of the Caucasian Nak, the location of whose original domicile is still a moot point in some of the Uratrian remnants of the breakup of the Kingdom of Uratu, with the Transcaucasus being the most likely locality at which this fusion took place. It is thought that the Proto-Caucasian Nak and Proto-Horians had common ancestry. Thus, at least part of the genealogy of the Nak peoples can be attributed to the Hurians and their descendants, the Uratrians. From Horians to modern Vanak, there were many nation tribes that can be viewed as forming connecting links in the genealogical chain. Some Uratrian tribes were incorporated into other peoples, but the Vanak and Tovotushans resisted assimilation and are considered as the only linguistic and ethnic remnants of the Hurians and Uratrians. Despite the obscurity of their origins, the Hurians became one of the great and influential peoples of the Near East from the 3rd millennium BC to the 14th century BC. Their original homeland was probably South Caucasus down to the Armenian Plateau and the Zagros-Tartars Mountains. Later they extended to Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and northern Syria. The Hurrian language was neither Indo-European nor Semitic, but was akin to Northeast Caucasian languages, or Alduin languages, descendants of Uratrian, including Chechnyan and Luizguian. Horian language reached its akin in the period from the 16th to the 14th century BC. The generally accepted date for the downfall of Hurrian civilization is 1365 BC. The numerous clans of the Hurians, such as the Gutis, Hattians, Kassites, established the Kassite Kingdom in Babylonia in the 15th century BC. Kurti, Proto-Kurds, Matanis, Mushki, and Uratrians formed empires and city-states that bore their names. The Khurax's culture is also attributed to the Horians. It is generally accepted that a number of small Horian states gradually united to form the Empire of Matani. The Horians were so ubiquitous that many Indo-Iranian and Indo-European peoples are believed to have substantive Horian contributions in their ethnogenesis. For example, the Kurds consider themselves and their culture as descendants of the Horians and their civilization, despite linguistic differentiation. There are also suggestions that the ancestors of the Armenians were a mixture of Horians and Indo-European Paragians. However, linguistic evidence suggests that the Northeast Caucasians are the genuine descendants of the Horians. And so again, just detailing where these Horians are. In yellow is the map of the Horians. So genetically speaking, it's highly likely that Horians had haplogroup J, and phenotypically, Horians likely looked Armenoid because of geographically where they come from. So this is from How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads in yellow, specific part I'm going to read. The Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands and present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the Khurax's culture. 3 subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS282, and J1-Y5353 are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups. Suggests Northeast Caucasian languages who have originated from the Khurax's culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant, as well as support the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Horian to Northeast Caucasian. So here's the phenotype of the likely Horians as well. As we read, they would have likely had J markers, and then geographically, Horians lived in the common and mountainous regions of Asia Minor, especially Armenia and Anatolia, which is where we find the Armenoid phenotype. And the description is short-headed and high skull type with fleshy features, a flat occiput, and hooked nose, often black-haired with light brown skin. So that's likely what a Hurian would look like just based on geography. So the Horians, just putting everything together that we learned so far, the Horians likely descended from the core Araxes culture. The Horians were a Bronze Age people of the ancient Near East, but they were not Semites. They were a Caucasian people, and they spoke a Northeast Caucasian language. The Hurians resided in Anatolia, Syria, Armenia, basically south of the Caucasus in northern Mesopotamia. Based on the Hurians' background, they likely would have been carriers of haplogroup J and phenotypically looked Armenoid. And although they often assimilated and adopted the culture of surrounding peoples, they did have a powerful civilization called Matani, and they had great influence over other neighboring civilizations as well. But this is where we end with the Horians, the history of the Horians. The Kingdom of Uratu. We've mentioned in the past about the Uratrians and the Kingdom of Uratu, specifically in the Uratrian video and in the Horians video, so we're not going to be too long on them since we kind of got a good bit of understanding. But we're still going to dive in specifically for this video alone, dealing with the Uratrians. So, who are the Uratrians? Kingdom of Uratu. Uratu, the Iron Age kingdom, also known by the modern rendition of its endonym. The Kingdom of Van, centered around Lake Van in the historic Armenian highlands. The kingdom rose to power in the mid-9th century BC, but went into gradual decline and was eventually conquered by the Iranian Medes in the early 6th century BC. Since its rediscovery in the 19th century, Uratu, which is commonly believed to have been at least partially Armenian-speaking, has played a significant role in Armenian nationalism. Assyrian inscriptions of Shalmaneser I, 1274 BC, first mention Uratu as one of the states of Naniri, a loose confederation of small kingdoms and tribal states in the Armenian highlands in the 13th to 11th centuries BC, which he conquered. Uratu itself was the region around Lake Van. So here's just a map of Uratu so y'all can have a nice visualization of what we're talking about, the people, the place. And as you can see, here is Lake Van. And they said that the kingdom was situated around Lake Van. And it's not far also from the core Araxes rivers. Here's the Araxes River right here. And the Kora would have been right here, where the core Araxes culture would have been. But Uratu, of course, is a little bit more south in the upper Mesopotamia in the south of the Caucasus. So just nice visualization. And here's Assyria down here. So this is from Britannia, and Uratu, ancient country of Southwest Asia, centered in the mountainous range southeast of the Black Sea and southwest of the Caspian Sea. Today, the region is divided among Armenia, eastern Turkey, and northwest Iran, mentioned in Assyrian sources from the early 13th century BCE. Uratu enjoyed considerable political power in the Middle East in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. The Uratrians were succeeded in the area in the 6th century BCE by the Armenians. Uratu is an Assyrian name. The Uratrians themselves called their country Belesinilim, and their capital located at modern Lake Van, Tushpa. Most remains of Uratrian settlements are found between the four lakes, Seradir and Van in Turkey, Urma in Iran, and Savan in Armenia, with a sparser extension westward to the Euphrates River. And again, just visualizing this for you. So here in orange is Uratu, and here is Lake Van, right here, Uratu, and here is Lake Van, the capital. And by the way, this brown will be the Horians. So you see that they're overlapped with one another as well. But again, our main focus is Uratu for today. So, Uratu, this is from the Metropolitan Museum, and it reads, the Uratrians adapted the Assyrian cuneiform writing system, and the inscription of Saraduri I, referred to above, is written in the Assyrian language. His son, Ishpetui, circa 830 through 810 BC, and later rulers all wrote in the Uratrian language, distinctly related to the isolated non-Indo-European, non-Semitic Hurrian language. Remember, the Uratrians were a non-Semitic people. They spoke a non-Semitic language. In the second half of the 7th century BC, every Uratrian state known from excavations in Anatolia, Iran, and the Caucasus was destroyed, and judging from artifact evidence, closely in time to one another. The precise date of this massive organized attack and the identity of the perpetrators are still being investigated. Some scholars have suggested that the enemy was the nomadic Scythians and/or the Medes. Basically, it may have been Iranians, because Scythians are Iranians as well. Some type of Iranian people probably destroyed Uratu. So again, here's a map of Uratu, and just to visualize for you, here's Lake Van. Got Ashur or Assyria right there. And it's just south of the Caucasus and between the Black and Caspian Seas of the upper Mesopotamia. So this is from World History Encyclopedia, Uratu Civilization. Uratu, also known as the Kingdom of Uratu or the Kingdom of Van, was a civilization which developed in the Bronze and Iron Age of ancient Armenia, eastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran from the 9th century BCE, controlling territories through military might and the construction of fortresses. The kingdom boasted a lively production in the arts, especially metalwork. Surviving only 2 centuries, the kingdom mysteriously disappeared in the 6th century BCE and was only rediscovered as a distinct and recognizable ancient culture by excavations carried out in the 19th century. Uratu sprang from a confederation of kingdoms which had developed from the 14th or 13th century BCE onwards. A recognizable and independent state known as Uratu developed from the 9th century BCE, which combined the smaller kingdoms probably in response to an external threat from Assyria. The culture prospered thanks to settlement on the extensive fertile plateau, which was well supplied by rivers. Crops included wheat, barley, mint, rye, semsi, and flax. Viticulture was also important. Winemaking in the region, perhaps being the earliest elsewhere or anywhere, remains of fruit found at Uratu sites include palms, apples, cherries, quinces, and pomegranates. Animal husbandry prospered thanks to excellent mountain pastures, and sheep, goats, cattle, and horses were all bred. Mineral deposits in the area included gold, silver, copper, lead, iron, and tin. The location on the trade routes between the ancient Mediterranean and Asia and Anatolian cultures was another source of prosperity. Although protected by mountains in the north and south, defense was perpetually necessary against attackers from the east and west, eager to capitalize on the region's wealth. So here is a map of Uratu, just to show you again where it's just generally at, the Kingdom of Uratu. You see like Van right here, and you see some of the mountain ranges that they're talking about, such as the Tartarus Mountains, which we mentioned quite often. So this is the typical land. Here's the Caucasus Mountains, south of the Caucasus Mountains. So this kind of gives you a good idea. Anatolia right here. So the government of Uratu functioned around a centralized monarchy with a close circle of advisors and a much larger group of civil administrators who supervised temples and such construction projects as fortresses, roads, and canals. The fortress capital, Tushpa, was built on a limestone promontory on the eastern shores of Lake Van in the highlands. Tushpa would later be called Van, and perhaps had a population as high as 50,000 at its peak. The kingdom's first known monarchy was Amram, who reigned 860 through 840 BCE. Assyrian sources mention that the kingdom first rose to prominence from 830 BCE under the king Suredu I, 835 through 825 BCE, whose descendants would rule for the next 2 centuries. All Uratu kings seem to have led their armies in battle. Weapons, as indicated by those depicted at temples, included iron and bronze swords, spears, and javelins, as well as bows. Heavy shields were used, which had large central bosses decorated with images of mythical creatures, bulls, and lions. There is evidence of helmets and metal scale armor, at least worn by the elite. The chief adversary was the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Although there is also evidence of trade relations between the two states, given the use of chariots by the Assyrians, it would seem reasonable to suppose that their adversary also employed them, especially given the Uratrians' fame for horse breeding. Uratu did enjoy some victories in the mid-8th century BCE, but the Assyrian ruler Tiglath-Pileser III, 1745 through 1727 BCE, was more aggressive than his predecessors, and he led siege to Tushpa. Another significant conflict between the two states was during the campaign of Sargon II, 722 through 705 BCE, and 1714 BCE. Other enemies of Uratu, including the Cimmerians, Scythians, and finally the Medes. The pantheon of the Uratrian religion contains a mix of unique and Horian gods, such as the god of storms and thunder, Tesheba, from the Hurian Teshub. In the 7th century BCE, the Uratu kingdom came to a mysterious but violent end when sometime between 640 and 590 BCE their cities were destroyed. The state was probably weakened by decades of battles with the Assyrians, and it may have been too overstretched to control its own empire. The perpetrators are not known, but the Scythians are one candidate, the Cimmerians another, and even possibly forces from within the territories administered by the Uratrian kings, basically like civil war. So again, here's just a map of Uratu. And as you can see, you have the different time periods for representing different colors. But for the most part, it was situated in the lower area of the Caucasus or south of the Caucasus. It even leaked into Iran, and it was in Anatolia or Turkey, and it was a quite uh, massive kingdom when you think about it. And here's Lake Van, and here is Tushpa. So, by the way, forgive me for any mispronunciations that I might say. So this book also details the kingdom and history of Uratu. It's called the Kingdom of Armenia, and it reads, "The Kingdom of Ararat, Uratu, as known to the Assyrians, or Belia Ina, or Belina Ili, as their natives called their country, was situated at the north and southeast of Lake Van. The fusion by conquest or trade of a number of Horian chieftainships, see chapter 2, had preceded, by the 13th century BC, a powerful kingdom which, after the 10th century BC, under a succession of vigorous kings, and extended and occupied the region between the upper Euphrates in the west and the Caspian Sea in the east, the Caucasus Mountains in the north, and the Tartarus Range in the south." So again, just giving the regions when it comes to Uratu. Here's just like Van again, and here is Mesopotamia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Georgia. So, and this is the orange is Greater Armenia, which was basically kind of like Uratu. So the Uratrians, based on their background and ethnic relations to the Horians, likely carried haplogroup J and looked Armenoid. So this will detail that very thing. This is from How Eurasia Was Born, only reading what's in yellow, and it reads, "The Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands in present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the core Araxes culture. Three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS2872, and J1-Y5353, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggest Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the core Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Horion to Northeast Caucasian." And the Armenoid phenotype: short-headed and high-skull type with fleshy features, a flat occiput and hooked nose, often black-haired with light brown skin, common in mountain regions of Asia Minor, especially Armenia and Anatolia. And this is the exact locations that we are talking about. So that's likely what they would have looked like. So the Uratrians, or Kingdom of Van in Armenia, was a Bronze Age society, and it was around the time of the Bronze Age to the Iron Age specifically, but being more or so centered around 900 BC to 600 BC, likely descended from the core Araxes culture and related to the Horians. They were a non-Semitic people, and they spoke a Caucasian language, being the sister language to the Hurians, and they worshipped Horian gods. And genetically speaking, they likely would have carried haplogroup J because they would have descended from the core Araxes culture, and they're a sister ethnic group to the Horians. And phenotypically, they likely would have looked Armenoid just based on their geographical location, and also them being a Caucasian people. But this is where we end with the history of the Uratrians, the Kingdom of Uratu. And this is where we end Haplogroup J equals Japheth Part 4. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and share the video. And don't forget to follow my social media accounts that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.